Hey guys, tonight we walk into the oldest written shadows. We can still reach into a land of reed marshes, brick cities, temple storehouses, and clay tablets pressed by careful hands, while the rivers slide through the dark like black silk. You can almost feel the damp earth under your sandals already, and somewhere ahead a lamp is burning low beside a scribe who does not yet know that people thousands of years later will squint at his tablet and wonder whether these stories are describing gods, kings, ideas, or some uneasy mixture of all three. Some parts of tonight's journey are widely accepted history, some are interpretation, and some are calm. What if imagination? Because the evidence is real but incomplete, and historians debate plenty of the foggy edges. You probably would not survive this place very gracefully, by the way. Between the heat, the mud, the river labour, and the total lack of modern air conditioning, you would last about 6 dramatic minutes before begging for a folding chair and an iced drink. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you feel like it, post your location and local time down below. I always like seeing where in the world these late night wanderings find you. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You begin in southern Mesopotamia, where the land is flat, the horizon is wide, and nearly everything important depends on water behaving itself for once. Most historians agree that the earliest Sumerian cities rose in a difficult environment shaped by the Tigris and Euphrates river systems, with irrigation channels, shifting banks and fields that needed constant human attention. This is not the romantic version of ancient life with tasteful movie dust and one noble flute in the background. This is mud-sweat accounting and arguments about grain. The evidence we do have points to a world held together by labour so ordinary and relentless that it almost disappears from the grand stories. Canals must be cleared, walls must be patched, storehouses must be counted, sheep must be watched by someone who definitely did not dream of becoming a sheep watcher when he was a boy. Archaeology suggests that temple complexes stood at the centre of much of this world, not only as religious places, but as institutions tied to land rations, workshops, and administration. In other words, the gods lived upstairs and paperwork lived downstairs, which honestly may be the most ancient tradition of all. You move through one of these early cities in your mind, past mud brick houses huddled under the sun. The streets are narrow, dust sits on everything. Somewhere bread is baking. Somewhere else someone is already irritated with a donkey. The buildings do not gleam, they absorb heat and silence. Even the air feels used. And yet this world leaves behind something astonishingly delicate, words pressed into clay, while the clay is still soft, then dried, sometimes baked by accident in fires, and kept alive by luck as much as by intention. What's broadly accepted is that cuneiform, one of the world's earliest writing systems, developed in Mesopotamia for practical reasons before it carried epic poetry and myth. Lists came first. Goods, numbers, deliveries. Human beings, as usual, invented transcendent literature only after inventing inventory. One interpretation is that this matters more than it seems. If a civilization learns first to count grain labour and offerings, then later tell stories about why humans exist, those stories may carry the smell of the storehouse with them. A careful reading might suggest that even the grandest myths keep one sandal planted in administration, and that is where the Anunnaki begin to drift into view. Not yet as internet legend, not yet as cosmic engineers in polished modern fantasies, but as ancient divine figures in a world already preoccupied with hierarchy, duty, and survival. Most historians agree that in Mesopotamian literature, divine beings were not simple cartoon characters with one fixed job description. Their identities and functions could shift across cities, periods, and languages. The evidence we do have points to a long tradition in which the Anunnaki appear as powerful deities associated with the divine order, sometimes connected with the underworld, sometimes the assembly of gods, sometimes broader cosmic authority. Historians still argue whether the name always referred to the same exact group in the same exact way. That uncertainty matters. It keeps us honest. Let me rephrase that more carefully. When you see the word Anunnaki, you should not imagine one tidy caste list laminated for your convenience. Ancient religion was not a streaming platform with clean character bios. It was layered, local, political, and often gloriously inconsistent. Still, once the word enters the story, something in the atmosphere changes. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. Because the farther you move from receipts and ration lists into mythic material, the more the ground turns soft beneath your feet. We'll keep the solid ground separate from the mist. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. So you step closer to the tablets themselves, or rather to the surviving copies, because what we read now often comes from later versions written centuries after the earliest Sumerian traditions first took shape. Already there is a quiet problem. Ancient stories are survivors, but they are also renovations. Scribes copied older material, adapted it, translated it, reorganized it, and sometimes fitted it to the needs of their own age. A more cautious explanation could be that when a text sounds strange or contradictory, it may reflect that long journey rather than a buried conspiracy. But what if the story is pointing at something else? What if behind the polished version there once stood rougher ideas, less settled, less flattering, more unsettling to the people who passed them on? That's a possibility, not a certainty. To be clear, this is debated. You can picture the scribe now, seated with damp clay and a stylus cut from reed. His hand presses wedge marks into the surface with patient force. Outside the city keeps breathing. Sandals, scuffing jars, clinking low voices moving through courtyards. He is not writing for you. He is writing for his own world. One in which gods are not abstract beliefs, but structuring presences woven into kingship land, storms, fertility and fear. If he writes of divine beings creating humans, he may be doing many things at once, preserving myth, explaining duty, protecting tradition, and giving cosmic weight to ordinary labour. One interpretation is that creation stories in Mesopotamia often say as much about social order as they do about origins. If humans are made to work, serve, maintain offerings, and support divine institutions, then myth becomes a mirror held up to civilization itself. You are not just hearing where people came from. You are hearing what people were told they were for. And this is where tonight's title begins to stir at the edges. Sumerian texts reveal perhaps too dramatically stated a question rather than a verdict. Did ancient Mesopotamian traditions preserve a memory, however distorted, of humanity being fashioned in stages, adjusted, replaced or symbolically remade? Most historians agree that Mesopotamian myths do describe divine creation in ways tied to labour and order. A fringe idea proposes that these stories hint at multiple versions of humans, one of them somehow erased. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it lingers because the texts are fragmentary enough to invite restless minds. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, the puzzle becomes more interesting and much less silly. Because erased does not always mean burned dramatically in a movie vault while thunder rolls on cue. Sometimes erased means copied over, softened, reframed, left a crack in a corner, forgotten because a newer version suited power better. Human institutions are very good at quiet editing. They have had lots of practice. For now, though, you stay with the clay, the reeds, the warm night air, and the first unsettling thought. Not that ancient people left behind a secret answer, but that they left behind a series of clues shaped by labour, devotion, and memory. The story may be about gods, it may be about kings, it may be about what it feels like to live in a world where your work belongs to someone higher. And somewhere inside that old unease there may be room for one more question, barely visible under the surface of the tablet, waiting for your eyes to adjust. The clay cools a little in the night air, and as you linger beside those tablets, the word itself begins to matter almost as much as the story attached to it. Anunnaki. It has the weight of something ceremonial when you say it slowly, the kind of name that seems to arrive already carrying incense hierarchy and a fair amount of human projection. Most historians agree that the Anunnaki belong to the world of Mesopotamian religion as a class or group of deities, especially in Sumerian and Akkadian traditions, though their exact role is not fixed in one neat eternal definition. Archaeology suggests that ancient belief systems across Mesopotamia were never as tidy as modern summaries pretend. Gods shifted in importance. Cities promoted their own favourites. Priests interpreted, merged, reworked, and emphasised as needed. So when later readers act as though the Anunnaki come with a user manual and a branded identity package, you can almost hear ancient scribes sighing from beyond the grave. What's broadly accepted is that the name is often linked with divine descent or princely lineage among the gods, though scholars continue to debate the best way to understand its earliest nuances. Historians still argue whether the Anunnaki were originally imagined as a specific genealogical group, a divine assembly, or a more fluid category whose meaning changed depending on place and period. That uncertainty is not a flaw in the study, it is the study. Ancient religion tends to behave like a river in flood season. You can trace the channel, but good luck forcing every bend to stay put. You continue through the literary world where these beings appear, and you quickly notice that the Anunnaki do not always enter the room doing the same job. In some texts they seem tied to high cosmic authority. In others they are associated with judgment or the underworld. A careful reading might suggest that the term functioned more like a title with changing emphasis than a fixed roster of personalities. One interpretation is that later readers have sometimes mistaken this flexibility for hidden depth, when it may simply reflect the living adaptive nature of Mesopotamian theology. Then again, what if the shifting roles are exactly what make them so haunting? A figure that never settles into one form is harder to pin down, and therefore much easier to mythologize. You can see how the misunderstanding starts. A mysterious ancient name, fragmentary tablets, translation gaps, a lot of missing context. Human beings are basically incapable of leaving that recipe alone. Give us half a line of damaged cuneiform and we will build an empire of theories by lunchtime. By dinner, someone has added aliens. This is why historians drink tea in silence. Still, the historical picture is interesting enough without launching the Anunnaki into outer space. The evidence we do have points to a religion embedded in earthly concerns: crops, kingship, rivers, fertility, war, justice, and death. Divine beings were not escapist fantasy decorations. They were woven into how Mesopotamians understood power itself. If a city rose, if a king ruled, if a harvest held, if a flood spared the canals, these things lived inside a sacred framework. The gods did not merely symbolize order. They were order, at least in the imagination of the culture that served them. That helps explain why names like Anunnaki could carry such gravity. One interpretation is that the word gathered force precisely because it stood near the top of the invisible chain of command. Not every god needed to be equally intimate. Some deities feel close, domestic, almost local. Others feel administrative in the most cosmic sense, like they preside over verdicts nobody gets to appeal. The Anunnaki sometimes seem to belong to that second mood. They are not necessarily warm presences. They are presences with rank. And rank matters in Mesopotamia. You can feel it everywhere. In the temple courtyards, in the ration systems, in the long lists of who owes what to whom. Most historians agree that early Mesopotamian society was strongly hierarchical, and its myths often mirror that structure. A more cautious explanation could be that the divine world looked organised because human institutions were organised that way, not because people were recording literal observations of a supernatural bureaucracy. But if we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, you can still ask a more unsettling question: what if these divine hierarchies felt so vivid because they explained something ordinary and painful about human life, namely that someone above you is always making decisions you must live with? That may be why later creation traditions become so compelling. If the Anunnaki or gods associated with similar authority stand somewhere near the origin of humanity in the mythic imagination, then the story is already tilted toward control, purpose and duty. You are not listening to a cosy tale about a loving universe handcrafting each soul like a boutique gift item. You are listening to cultures wrestling with labour, service, survival, and the shape of obedience. Ancient myths can be poetic, but they are rarely sentimental in the modern way. They have bills to pay. The mystery grows deeper because the Anunnaki belong not just to one city or one frozen text, but to a broader shifting literary landscape. Sumerian traditions flow into Akkadian ones. Earlier motifs appear in later compositions. Names and functions are recontextualized. The evidence we do have points to continuity, but also to reinterpretation across centuries. A fringe idea proposes that this shifting tradition conceals a sanitized narrative, as though later scribes carefully buried the original truth about divine experiments with humanity. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it survives because ancient textual transmission really does involve selection and survival. Some stories were copied because they mattered. Others vanished because clay breaks, libraries burn, dynasties fall, and human memory is not a museum curator with perfect attendance. If we stay on firmer ground, a careful reading might suggest something less dramatic, but still powerful. Maybe what changed over time was not the memory of literal events, but the emotional purpose of the story. Earlier layers may have emphasized divine conflict, labor, and cosmic disorder in one way. Later layers may have reshaped the same material to support a cleaner theology or stronger kingship ideology. That is not proof of a cover-up. Let me rephrase that more carefully. It is evidence that myths evolve when societies evolve, and evolution can look suspiciously like editing when you read backward through broken pieces. You imagine a tablet room, now shelves lined with clay, each piece holding only part of a world. Some are school exercises, some are hymns, some are myths copied by apprentice hands under stern supervision. Somewhere in this dim archive the name Anunnaki appears again, and each appearance carries slightly different weather. The same word, but not always the same sky above it. That is why the safest path is also the strangest. We are not proving anything tonight, we're following clues. The clues say this much. Most historians agree that the Anunnaki were ancient divine figures, not modern science fiction architects in the academic record. Archaeology suggests that their roles shifted over long periods and across genres. One interpretation is that those shifts preserve traces of changing human fears about authority, duty, and identity. And what if the story is pointing at something else? What if the reason the Anunnaki feel so elusive is that they were never meant to answer one question cleanly, but to hover over many of them at once? Who commands, who serves, who remembers, and who gets rewritten when the story hardens into official form? You stay there with the name a little longer, feeling how it settles into the room like old smoke. Not yet the makers of a mysterious erased humanity, not yet the centre of the speculation to come, but already the kind of beings around whom a culture might build explanations for work, suffering, rank, and order. And once a name like that enters the imagination, it tends to attract every loose thread nearby. The gods become mighty, the mighty become distant, the distant become interpretable, and somewhere between the text and the silence around it, you begin to sense that the real puzzle may not be who the Anunnaki were, but why later generations kept needing them to mean just a little more. That need for the gods to mean a little more begins as so many ancient problems do with work. Not noble work in the abstract, not the motivational poster version with sunrise lighting and an inspirational slogan, but the grinding, repetitive, backbending kind that keeps a floodplain civilization from quietly falling apart. You feel it before you even see it. The damp edge of canal mud sucking at your sandals, the sharp smell of cut reeds drying in the heat, the grain dust clinging to skin, the ache in your shoulders from lifting, dragging, clearing, stacking, smoothing, mending. Most historians agree that early Mesopotamian life depended on collective labour at a scale that is hard to romanticize. Irrigation channels had to be dug and maintained. Fields had to be managed. Storehouses had to be monitored. Temples and workshops needed hands, and a lot of them. Archaeology suggests that the first cities of southern Mesopotamia were only possible because people coordinated labour in highly organised ways. Water, that unreliable miracle, had to be persuaded into canals, checked by embankments, redirected by sluices, and watched with a level of patience that would make modern group projects look like a spa retreat. The evidence we do have points to a society where labour was not a side note to civilization, it was civilization. Without it, the mud walls soften the fields, salt over the grain, fails, and the whole shining experiment of urban life slides back into marsh and memory. That reality gives a curious force to the myths in which the gods themselves seem to complain about labour. One interpretation is that stories of lesser divine beings toiling before humans exist preserve a symbolic mirror of ordinary Mesopotamian life. If even the gods are imagined as resenting endless work, then you are hearing not only theology, but a very old human sigh pressed into narrative form. A careful reading might suggest that these myths put labour so close to the centre of the cosmos because labour sat at the centre of society. In other words, people did not merely work in the world. They lived in a world that explained itself through work. Historians still argue whether these stories should be read mainly as sacred narrative political metaphor or social reflection wrapped in sacred language. Probably all three, depending on the tablet and the century. Ancient people, inconveniently for neat modern categories, were capable of being religious, practical, poetic, and political all at once. They did not separate those instincts into tidy folders. They just wrote them into the same clay and let future scholars develop very patient headaches. You start to hear the outline of a mythic problem. In later Mesopotamian traditions, especially in Akkadian, material like atrahasis, there is the idea that divine labour becomes unbearable for certain gods, and humanity is created in response. What's broadly accepted is that this is one of the most striking themes in the surviving literature. Humans are connected to the burden of work service and maintenance. That much is solid ground. The more difficult question is how old that theme really is, how much of it reaches back into Sumerian tradition, and how much changed as stories moved across languages and centuries. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. There is no single Sumerian tablet that neatly hands you a grand diagram labelled original human version, followed by an apologetic note from management. That would be very convenient, and ancient history is almost never that considerate. Instead, what you get are motifs, echoes, overlaps, and pieces of later compositions that may preserve older assumptions. One interpretation is that the burdened gods in these stories stand for lower-ranking labouring classes within the divine order, just as human workers stood beneath kings, priests, and officials. A more cautious explanation could be that this is not hidden memory, but mythic patterning the heavens arranged in the image of the city below. Still, the emotional power remains. Imagine a divine assembly where resentment is rising, where those assigned to the heaviest tasks are exhausted, and where the solution proposed is not rest reform or a cosmic wellness seminar, but a new kind of being to take over the work. You can see why the later imagination grabs hold of that image. It feels chillingly modern in the worst way. When institutions face strain, they often solve it by producing more workers rather than less obligation. Even in myth, management finds a workaround. The strange thing is that this may be precisely why such stories endure. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian myths do not emerge from an idle culture. They emerge from a civilization deeply aware of toil hierarchy and dependence on systems larger than any one person. If gods are imagined as weary workers, that weariness does not make them less divine. It makes the cosmos feel legible. It also makes the creation of humanity sound less like a blessing and more like a transfer order. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if beneath the divine complaint there lies a quieter human fear that to be made is to be assigned, and to exist is to inherit someone else's unfinished burden? That is not a historical claim. That is gentle imagination leaning into the mood of the texts. But it helps explain why the myths about human origins in Mesopotamia can feel so different from later traditions that emphasize innocence, beauty, or intimate care. Here, creation may carry the smell of wet clay and overtime. A fringe idea proposes that references to divine dissatisfaction preserve memory of multiple attempts at creating a workable human servant species, as though the gods were revising a project until it met requirements. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it takes energy from the way ancient myths sometimes contain repetition, adjustment, and narrative layering. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it becomes less a literal laboratory scene and more a way of asking whether ancient storytellers imagined humanity as the answer to an earlier failure. That possibility is suggestive, not conclusive. To stay grounded, you return to the city itself. Men haul baskets. Women grind grain. Children fetch water or chase each other through sun-struck courtyards until an adult tells them to stop being adorable near expensive storage jars. Priests supervise offerings. Officials count rations. Everyone seems either busy or one bad season away from trouble. The evidence we do have points to a society where no one needed a philosopher to explain that survival was collective and exhausting. So when myths speak of burdened gods, they may be dramatizing something every listener already knows in his bones. You can almost hear those listeners gathered in dim spaces. The stories recited or remembered, the names of God spoken, with reverence, caution, and familiarity. Perhaps they hear the complaint of divine labourers and recognise themselves. Perhaps they hear the solution, humanity, and feel both elevated and trapped by it. One interpretation is that such myths offer dignity through sacred purpose. Another is that they normalise service by making it cosmic. Both readings may be true at once. Ancient stories are annoyingly good at that, and so the pressure builds. Not yet toward the making of humans, but toward the need for them. The gods, or at least some of them, are tired. The system requires labour. Order must be maintained. Offerings must continue. Canals do not clear themselves, no matter how much you glare at them. Somewhere in the mythic distance, a decision is forming. And as you stand in that long pause before creation, with the reed beds whispering, and the city settling under the heat of a Mesopotamian dusk, you begin to sense that humanity may enter the story not as a beloved surprise, but as a practical solution to a divine problem. So the decision begins to take shape in the hush after complaint, in that old mythic moment when a system under strain looks for a new layer to carry the weight. You can almost feel the pause before it happens, like the stillness over an irrigation canal at dusk, when even the reeds seem to listen. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian creation stories often describe humanity in functional terms, tied to labour offerings and the maintenance of order. That is the firm ground beneath your feet tonight. Human beings in these traditions are not always introduced as the emotional centre of the universe. Very often they arrive as part of the machinery that keeps the divine and earthly world running. What's broadly accepted is that different Mesopotamian texts preserve different versions of this idea. Some are Sumerian in origin. Some survive in Akkadian compositions written much later. Some overlap. Some contradict each other just enough to keep every graduate seminar alive out of sheer stubbornness. Historians still argue whether the various creation motifs reflect separate traditions later woven together, or whether they preserve a more fluid, mythic landscape in which no single version was ever supposed to dominate. That matters because once you start asking whether humans were imagined in stages revised, replaced, or symbolically remade, you are really asking how ancient stories handled repetition and variation. And repetition is everywhere in old literature. A god is named one way in one city, another way elsewhere. A role expands, contracts, or drifts. A cosmic event appears with different emphasis depending on who is telling it and why. One interpretation is that this does not weaken the texts. It reveals them as living tradition. A more cautious explanation could be that when modern readers notice multiple creation moments or layered descriptions of humanity, they are not discovering a buried scandal, but the normal behaviour of ancient myth. Still, what if the first design was not quite the last? What if the shifting stories preserve a memory, however symbolic, that being human was imagined as something adjusted over time? That is a possibility, not a certainty. You move now into the emotional centre of the problem. If humanity is made because labour must be offloaded, then the first humans are not simply children of the gods. In a tender sense, they are workers, sacred workers perhaps, but workers all the same. Archaeology suggests that Mesopotamian temple institutions relied on extensive systems of production, including grain processing, weaving, herding, and redistribution. The evidence we do have points to societies that understood service, not as a metaphor, but as an organising principle. So when the myths cast humans as servants of divine needs, the story may be placing earthly social order into cosmic language. One interpretation is that myth made duty feel ancient, inevitable, and blessed from above, which, if you are the one doing the hauling, may not have felt especially flattering. You can picture it. A city where everyone seems tied to a task. A temple where every offering must arrive on time. A field where one delay in water management can ruin a season. In such a world, the idea that humans were created for work would not sound shocking. It would sound plausible in the saddest possible way, like hearing your job description read by the stars. That is why these creation stories can feel so oddly cold. Not cruel exactly, but practical. The cosmos in Mesopotamian myth often behaves less like a kindly parent and more like an institution with responsibilities. A fringe idea proposes that when some ancient texts imply difficulty, disorder, or dissatisfaction before the final creation of humankind, they may hint that earlier human forms were attempted and abandoned. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it appears often in modern retellings, because the surviving myths do contain layers, revisions, and traces of multiple narrative logics. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it becomes a useful lens rather than a literal claim. You are not forced to imagine a divine workshop full of rejected prototypes standing around awkwardly like cancelled appliances. Instead, you can ask whether the texts preserve an older sense that humanity's place in the cosmic order was once imagined differently, then later smoothed into a more stable version. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. No surviving mainstream academic reading requires you to believe that Mesopotamian scribes were secretly confessing to raised biological models of humanity. Let me rephrase that more carefully. What the texts clearly offer is narrative layering around why humans exist. What they may also offer, depending on how cautiously you read them, is a sense that creation was not a single clean moment in the mythic imagination, but part of an ongoing attempt to resolve tension between divine need and cosmic order. That ongoing quality matters. In many ancient traditions, creation is not always a polished beginning. It can be a repair, a compromise, a rearrangement after disorder. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian cosmology often places conflict, negotiation, and hierarchy close to the heart of how the world becomes stable. That means human origin stories may also carry those textures. A careful reading might suggest that when humans appear, they do so as the answer to an earlier imbalance, rather than as the first intention of the universe. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if the idea of an erased version of humanity is less about a literal missing species and more about a missing stage in the emotional logic of the myth? Before humans become accepted and named within order, perhaps there was an uncomfortable imaginative space in which the gods, and therefore the storytellers, were not yet sure what kind of beings were needed. A possibility, not a certainty, but it gives the old stories a strange tenderness, not because the gods are gentle, but because the myths admit uncertainty before settling into purpose. You remain with the clay image now. Wet earth gathered from the riverbanks, hands shaping form, breath or essence or sacred substance entering the mixture. Whether literal, symbolic, or both, clay is the right material for this world. It is everywhere. The houses are made from it. The tablets are made from it. The people walk on it, build with it, and return to it. Archaeology suggests that clay, in Mesopotamian thought, was not a quaint poetic flourish. It was the material of civilization itself. So when myths imagine humans emerging from clay, the symbolism feels almost unavoidable. Humanity is made from the same vulnerable stuff as the city, and vulnerable things can be remade. That is where the unease sharpens. If you are formed from mud, from labour, from need, then you may also be imagined as revisable. A more cautious explanation could be that this is simply how mythic symbolism works. Clay means mortality dependence, earthly origin. But one interpretation is that clay also carries the idea of adjustment. Something moulded can be remoulded, something written into clay can be scraped, broken, or rewritten. The motif folds back on itself. Human beings and tablets share the same weakness. Both can preserve memory, both can be altered. The city around you grows quieter. Lamps glow in doorways. The smell of grain mash and river water drifts through the warm air. Somewhere someone is still counting jars by lamplight, which is how you know civilization remains committed to ending the day with paperwork. And in that ordinary quiet, the mythic idea deepens. Humans may not have entered the story as the first and only answer. They may have entered as the answer that lasted. Whether that means earlier narrative forms, earlier symbolic possibilities, or some now lost variation in the tradition, the question remains suspended over the tablet like smoke. Not what humans are exactly, but whether the stories once imagined them otherwise before the final wording set like dried clay. And once the thought of clay settles in your mind, it becomes impossible to separate the making of humanity from the material reality of Mesopotamia itself. Everything here seems to begin in mud and dry into meaning. Walls, tablets, ovens, riverbanks, storage bins, roof bricks, ceilings, little figurines. And now in the mythic imagination, people. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian creation traditions often use clay as the substance from which humans are formed. And this is one of the most enduring and broadly accepted features of the ancient stories. What's broadly accepted is that clay works on several levels at once. It is practical, familiar, humble, and deeply symbolic. It reminds you that humans belong to the earth, depend on the river, and share in the same fragile substance as the cities they build. The evidence we do have points to a world where clay was not some decorative metaphor chosen by poets after a long walk in the moonlight. It was simply everywhere. Archaeology suggests that in southern Mesopotamia, where good building stone was scarce mud brick construction, dominated ordinary life, clay shaped the physical environment so thoroughly that it would have been almost natural to imagine human origin through the same substance. A careful reading might suggest that this is why the creation image feels so convincing. It is not abstract. It rises directly from touch. You can knead it, smooth it, press your thumb into it, watch it harden or crack. It is a material that remembers the hand. That may be one reason the myths can feel so intimate, even when their logic is stern. But clay alone is not always enough. In some Mesopotamian traditions, especially later ones, there is also the idea that something divine is mixed into the human recipe, blood essence, intelligence, or a sacred component associated with a god. Most historians agree that such themes appear in key texts, though historians still argue whether these details should be read primarily as theological symbolism, political metaphor, ritual language, or all three together. One interpretation is that mixing divine substance with clay helps explain why humans can serve the gods, yet also resemble them in limited ways. Mortal bodies below a trace of sacred participation within. That sounds lofty, until you remember the job description still involves hauling things. A more cautious explanation could be that divine blood or essence in these stories does not imply noble equality, but legitimized service. Humanity is important because it is useful, sacred because it is functional. The cosmic arrangement is not sentimental, it is administrative, with a religious fragrance which, if we are being honest, is still more charming than most modern office design. You at least get incense. Still, the recipe invites questions. If people are made from clay and divine material together, what is the story trying to say about human status? Are you a servant with a spark? A vessel for obligation? A bridge between dirt and divinity? The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. Because these old ingredients are doing several things at once. They explain mortality duty and sacred connection in a single image. They also leave the door slightly open for later readers to wonder whether humanity was imagined as modified material, as though Earth alone was not enough, and something had to be added, adjusted, or authorized. A fringe idea proposes that stories about mixing divine substance into clay preserve a distant memory of engineered beings rather than symbolic creation. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it has become very popular in modern mystery circles, because it sounds technical in a way ancient religion rarely intends. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, though, the more useful question is not whether Mesopotamians secretly described laboratory procedure. It is whether they imagined humanity as deliberately composed for a function which is a very different claim, and one much closer to the texts. That distinction matters. Let me rephrase that more carefully. The mainstream historical reading is that these myths describe symbolic creation within a religious worldview. The speculative reading says the symbols may point to something more literal or more layered. We are not proving anything tonight, we're following clues. And the clues at minimum suggest that ancient storytellers did not think of humans as appearing accidentally. Humans are fashioned, assembled, assigned. You stay with the image of the mixing for a while. A bowl perhaps, hands gathering wet earth, a sacred act performed in language or imagination, the smell of river clay thick in the air, somewhere in the background, a temple courtyard humming with tasks that never end. One interpretation is that the clay and divine essence formula compresses the entire Mesopotamian worldview into a single scene. Human beings belong below to the mud, the sweat, the fields, the bricks, but they also belong inside a sacred chain of order that links earth to heaven, labour to ritual task to offering. Historians still argue whether the divine ingredient in these stories was meant to explain intelligence, obedience, ritual capacity, or simply the dignity of human participation in the cosmic system. There's no full consensus, and that lack of consensus is important. It reminds you not to flatten the story into one message. Ancient myths are layered because the societies that told them were layered. Priests, kings, workers, scribes and families might all hear the same myth differently. A ruler may hear divine order. A priest may hear sacred obligation. A labourer may hear that the universe has somehow managed to turn exhaustion into destiny. And then there is the quieter possibility. What if the recipe sounds careful because the creators within the story are trying to solve a problem rather than merely express power? What if the clay must be mixed properly because an earlier arrangement did not hold? That is a possibility, not a certainty. But the question begins to shadow the text. If humanity is composed, then composition implies choice. If there is choice, there may have been alternatives. And if there were alternatives, then somewhere behind the final myth, there may linger the ghost of a version that did not last. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. There is no securely established tablet line saying in effect, "First attempt, unsuccessful. Please revise and return to divine assembly by dawn." Ancient scribes missed a real opportunity there, but the layered traditions, the symbolic ingredients, and the recurring connection between humans and service do raise the possibility that the ancient imagination did not picture humanity as inevitable. Rather, humanity may have been imagined as a solution shaped to meet conditions. That is suggestive, not conclusive. And because clay is so humble, the whole scene feels more unsettling, not less. Gold would flatter you, fire would dramatise you, but Mud says you are practical. Mud says you were made from what was on hand. Mud says the river gives and the river takes, and in between, someone shaped a worker out of the banks and taught him to stand upright long enough to keep the canal walls from collapsing. The night deepens around you. Reed shadows tremble near the water. A dog barks somewhere in the distance, probably at a moon it suspects of poor management. In a nearby room, a tablet dries after being inscribed, the marks settling into permanence, at least until breakage, dampness, war, or human forgetfulness intervene. The image stays with you, clay, mixed with something more made for a purpose bearing both mortality and mandate. And as the silence gathers around that old recipe, you begin to sense that the real question is not simply what humans were made from, but why the storytellers wanted the mixture to sound so deliberate, as though getting humanity exactly right mattered more than they were willing to say aloud. And that sense of deliberation leads you naturally to the next question. The one ancient creation stories seem to circle with almost uncomfortable honesty. Why make humans at all? Not in the modern philosophical sense, with soft music and a horizon shot, and somebody whispering about purpose. Mesopotamian myth is usually less interested in your personal fulfillment than in whether the fields are managed. The offerings arrive and the cosmic order stays upright for another season. Most historians agree that in Mesopotamian creation traditions, humanity is often presented as having a functional role within a divine and social system. What's broadly accepted is that people are made not simply to exist, but to serve, maintain, cultivate, build and sustain the pattern of life that connects gods, temples, rulers and land. Archaeology suggests that temple economies in ancient Mesopotamia were deeply involved in production and administration. They managed land, livestock, labour, textiles, grain, and ritual obligations with a seriousness that would make a modern operations manager weep with admiration. The evidence we do have points to institutions that were both sacred and practical, and that combination matters. One interpretation is that when myths describe humans as created to take over labour or provide for the gods through offerings and upkeep, they are not inventing an abstract spiritual duty out of nowhere. They are reflecting the real structure of Mesopotamian life, in which divine service and economic labour were woven tightly together. You can feel that fusion everywhere. The temple is not merely a place where people go to feel reverent for an hour and then head home for snacks. It is an active centre of storage, distribution, ritual and authority. Grain moves through it, wool moves through it, records move through it, workers move through it. If a myth explains humanity as the answer to divine need, then that need may sound theological on the surface, but administrative underneath. A careful reading might suggest that creation stories sacralized labour by moving it into the sky first, and then reflecting it back down onto earth, which is a very efficient way to make work feel non-negotiable. Historians still argue whether these myths were mainly explanatory, legitimizing devotional or political in emphasis. The safest answer is probably all of the above. Ancient stories rarely wore only one hat, and if they did, it was probably a ceremonial hat with a tax implication. One interpretation is that the creation of humans served to justify social hierarchy by placing service at the centre of existence itself. A more cautious explanation could be that myths simply gave meaningful shape to realities people already experienced every day. In that view, the stories do not invent obligation. They give it language, rhythm, and divine context. Still, the effect is striking. If humans are made because labour must be done, then the origin story becomes a statement about utility. You are not merely alive, you are assigned. Most historians agree that this practical aspect of Mesopotamian anthropology, if we can call it that, without sounding too smug at bedtime, sets these traditions apart from later stories that emphasize innocence, temptation, or personal relationship with the Creator. Here the cosmic economy matters. Someone has to maintain the order of things. Humanity enters the scene because the system requires reliable hands. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if beneath that practical surface there is also anxiety? Not just about work, but about dependence. A civilization built on rivers, harvest cycles, and coordinated labour is always one bad flood, one failed canal, one lazy official, or one badly timed sandstorm away from trouble. So perhaps the creation of humans in myth reflects not just confidence in order, but fear that order is fragile and must be constantly fed. That is not a firm historical claim. It is gentle imagination leaning into the emotional landscape. But it fits the mood of a world where survival depends on keeping many moving parts from drifting apart. A fringe idea proposes that humans were created as a replacement workforce after some earlier category of beings proved unreliable or rebellious, and that later traditions soften this into a cleaner creation story. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it draws energy from the way Mesopotamian myths preserve divine conflict complaints and negotiated solutions. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, the interesting part is not whether there were literal experimental beings before humans. It is whether the myths imply that humanity was imagined as the successful solution to a previous failure in cosmic labour relations. That's a possibility, not a certainty. The solid ground remains. This the evidence we do have points to labour, as one of the main keys to understanding human purpose in Mesopotamian mythology, even when later texts add drama, divine blood, conflict, or flood the practical function of humanity often remains visible. People are there to bear burdens, maintain offerings, and keep the machinery of sacred civilization moving. One interpretation is that this gave ordinary toil a kind of dignity. Another is that it made hierarchy feel inevitable. Both may be true, which is annoyingly realistic. human societies are very skilled at calling necessity meaningful while quietly benefiting from who does the lifting. You walk again through the city in your mind. A brewer checks jars. A woman spins wool with practiced rhythm. A team of labourers drags materials toward a work site. A scribe presses wedge after wedge into clay, converting motion into memory. The whole place hums with task. Archaeology suggests that specialisation and organised labour were central to urban Mesopotamian life, though obviously not everyone had the same status, comfort, or access to temple resources. Most historians agree that this daily structure would have shaped how listeners heard creation myths. A story about beings made for service would not sound exotic. It would sound familiar enough to be almost invisible. And perhaps that is what makes it haunting. The myth does not need to frighten you with monsters. It only needs to tell you that the deepest reason for your existence may be the continuation of someone else's order. That is a very old kind of unease. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. Did ancient listeners fully embrace this purpose, resist it inwardly, reinterpret it in private, or simply live with it the way people live with weather? We do not know. The tablets preserve the official words more often than the private sighs. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. We cannot recover the exact emotions of every worker priest or ruler who heard these stories, but a careful reading might suggest that the myths worked precisely because they could hold several meanings at once. For elites, they affirmed order. For ritual specialists, they affirmed sacred duty. For ordinary people, they may have offered a way to see endless labour as woven into a larger pattern, which is at least more comforting than being told the canal must be cleared simply because the canal must be cleared. Though to be fair, the canal still needs clearing. As the night air thickens and the city settles into a quieter rhythm, you begin to understand why the creation of humans in these stories feels so deliberate. It is not just that people are made, it is that they are made for something exact. A need existed, a burden pressed down, a system strained, and into that strain stepped humanity shaped from familiar earth and given a role too practical to be accidental. Whether that role emerged all at once or through older, rougher narrative layers, we can no longer fully see the effect is the same. The human being in Mesopotamian myth does not drift into the world by chance. He arrives like a tool placed carefully on a workbench, necessary, purposeful, and perhaps more replaceable than he would like to believe. And once you begin to suspect that humanity arrives in these stories as a practical answer to strain, the tablets themselves start to look different. Not just ancient, not just impressive, but layered in the way a riverbank is layered with newer silt resting over older floodlines. You can still trace if the light hits at the right angle. Most historians agree that what survives of Mesopotamian literature comes to us in fragments, recensions, school copies, translations, and rewritten versions spread across centuries. What's broadly accepted is that Sumerian and Akkadian traditions overlap without becoming identical, and that many myths we read today survive in forms shaped by later scribes. So when a story seems inconsistent, doubled, or slightly at odds with itself, that may not be a mistake. It may be the normal condition of very old memory. Historians still argue whether the contradictions between Sumerian and Akkadian materials reflect changing theology, different local traditions, scribal creativity, or the simple fact that ancient literature was never meant to behave like a modern reference book. That uncertainty is not a nuisance to be cleared away, it is part of the meaning. One interpretation is that the shifts between versions show societies renegotiating their relationship to the divine. A more cautious explanation could be that myths changed because language changed, empires changed, and schools kept copying what mattered to them in the forms they understood best. Either way, the result is the same. You're not looking at one voice, You are listening through an echo chamber of many voices, and some of them do not fully agree. That matters for tonight's question more than it might first seem. If later readers wonder whether Mesopotamian stories preserve hints of altered or erased versions of humanity, the answer may lie less in one explosive line and more in the spaces between traditions. The evidence we do have points to continuity, yes, but also to drift. Motifs survive while meanings shift. Divine roles remain familiar while their emotional weight changes. A careful reading might suggest that the creation of humanity was never a single frozen idea, but a cluster of related ideas arranged differently in different times and places. You can almost picture the movement of the tradition itself. A Sumerian hymn is copied in one city. Centuries later, an Akkadian scribe preserves a related theme in a different form. A theological point, once obvious to one audience, becomes obscure to another, so it gets adjusted, clarified, or folded into a new narrative frame. Some pieces vanish, others gain prestige. Ancient stories do not sit still. They travel in the hands of people with deadlines, loyalties, and limited shelf space, which is frankly a terrible environment for perfect preservation, and an excellent one for slow transformation. One interpretation is that this is where the most intriguing possibilities live. Not in dramatic claims, but in accumulated edits. If Sumerian and Akkadian creation motifs do not line up perfectly, perhaps they reflect deeper tensions about what humans are, for how gods relate to labour, and how cosmic order is best explained. A fringe idea proposes that such tensions point to a lost original story about multiple human types, or failed creations that later scribes intentionally softened. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it remains attractive, because textual layering is real, and real layering invites imaginative overreach the way honey invites ants. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, though, a subtler picture comes into view. Perhaps what was erased was not a literal first humanity, but an older imaginative openness. Early traditions may have been rougher, less systematized, more willing to let the divine world feel unstable. Later traditions may have preferred order, sequence, and theological polish. That is not proof of suppression. Let me rephrase that more carefully. It is the sort of shift you might expect whenever a long-lived civilization retells its oldest stories under new political and religious conditions. Archaeology suggests that Mesopotamian literate culture depended heavily on scribal education, copying and preservation in institutional settings. Tablets were learned, recited, imitated and transmitted by people trained within particular systems of value. The evidence we do have points to active preservation, but also selection. Not every story was copied forever. Not every line made it into the next age. Some broke. Some were neglected. Some simply stopped being useful. Human memory, even when organised by temples and schools, is still a ruthless editor. Libraries do not only save things, they also reveal what a culture chose to keep saving. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if the cracks between versions are not accidents at all in emotional terms, but clues to where the anxiety lived? In one age, perhaps the troubling question was why humans must serve. In another, it may have been how divine conflict became stable order. In another, how old myths could be made respectable inside newer frameworks. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. You cannot ask the dead scribe why he copied this phrase and left another aside. You cannot ask the apprentice what his teacher skipped. You are left with the surviving lines and the suspicious quiet around them. That quiet becomes especially powerful when the same broad themes recur: divine hierarchy, labour, service, human purpose, cosmic arrangement. These ideas endure, but not always with identical emphasis. Most historians agree that later Mesopotamian texts often preserve earlier motifs while reshaping them. One interpretation is that the narrative of human creation became more orderly over time because orderly myths support orderly institutions. A more cautious explanation could be that this is simply how traditions mature. They consolidate. They standardize. They prefer stability to unresolved tension. An unresolved tension may be exactly what later readers keep feeling underneath the surface, because if the stories were always neat, no one would wonder about lost layers. But they are not neat. They are full of joined seams and mismatched edges. Some are visible only if you linger. Others are obvious at once, like a patch in a wall that dried a different shade than the rest. You begin to sense that the old texts are not hiding a clean secret. They are exposing a messy process. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. We cannot confidently reconstruct an original Sumerian master narrative of erased human versions and then accuse later scribes of a tidy cover-up. That would be far too dramatic for the evidence. But a careful reading might suggest that the movement from Sumerian to Akkadian tradition involved real theological and literary refinement, and that refinement may have narrowed certain possibilities while elevating others. In that sense, memory did split, not into truth and lie, but into pathways with some left open and some allowed to grow quiet. You sit with that as the lamp burns lower. A tablet edge catches the light. A line breaks off where the clay is chipped. The river breathes somewhere beyond the city walls. And in that soft darkness, the idea becomes almost comforting in its honesty. Ancient stories were never single roads. They were braided channels. Some remain visible, some silted over, some still run beneath the surface if you know where to place your hand. And perhaps the most human thing of all is not that the myths changed, but that later generations kept trying to hear, inside those changes, the faint sound of something older still. And as your ear adjusts to those braided channels of memory, you begin to notice something stranger than contradiction. Not just that the stories changed, but that some ideas seem to survive only as impressions, as if an older shape once pressed itself into the tradition and was later smoothed over without ever fully disappearing. Most historians agree that ancient scribes copied, adapted and reorganized myths across long stretches of time, and what's broadly accepted is that textual survival in Mesopotamia was selective rather than complete. Some works endured because they were taught, others endured because they were useful. Many vanished because clay breaks rooms, flood regimes, fall, and posterity has terrible filing habits. In a world like that, absence is not proof of suppression, but absence can still feel suggestive. One interpretation is that when later myths show signs of awkward seams, repeated motifs, or compressed explanations, they may preserve the shadow of earlier, more expansive narrative possibilities. A more cautious explanation could be that these are simply the ordinary marks of oral tradition entering written form and then being revised in schools. That may sound less exciting than the idea of a buried cosmic scandal, but ancient literature does not need help being mysterious. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if the version that didn't last is not a literal race of earlier humans, but a less settled account of what humans were imagined to be, before later tradition gave them a cleaner job description? That possibility becomes especially interesting once you remember how often myth does its tidying in silence. Nobody announces in a grand official memo that the old awkward version has been retired. Stories simply get retold with different emphasis. A god once central becomes secondary. A conflict once vivid becomes background. A difficult ambiguity gets folded into a more stable line. Human institutions do this all the time. They call it refinement when they like it, and confusion when they do not. Ancient scribes, being human, were almost certainly no exception. Historians still argue whether the surviving Mesopotamian creation traditions preserve evidence of genuinely separate anthropogonies, separate origin accounts for humanity, or whether they mostly reflect one broad set of ideas expressed in multiple literary forms. The evidence we do have points to both continuity and variation. That tension matters. If human creation could be told in different ways, then the final version most familiar to later readers may not be the only one that once circulated. It may just be the version that won the copying contest, which is a very ancient form of success and still depressingly recognisable. You picture the tablet room again. Shelves stacked with clay. Some pieces carefully dried, some already chipped at the corner, some recopied by apprentices whose minds occasionally drift because, even in antiquity, not every student was spiritually alive during class. A teacher corrects a sign. A priest requests a text. A scribe copies a myth that has already passed through generations of hands. The words feel old, but the copy is new. Archaeology suggests that much of what survives from Mesopotamian literature comes through this institutional chain of preservation. The evidence we do have points to care, but also to filtration. The chain keeps things alive by narrowing them. That narrowing is where a lot of modern speculation takes root. A fringe idea proposes that references to disorderly or imperfect beings in ancient Near Eastern myth, broadly understood, may echo memories of failed human attempts later omitted from the official narrative. This theory isn't widely accepted, and in many cases it blends texts from different cultures far too casually, which is usually the historical equivalent of throwing all your spices into one pot and announcing you have invented scholarship. Still, if we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, the more interesting point is that ancient myth often retains traces of what it no longer explains fully. Something can be remembered as residue even when the framework that made it obvious is gone. A careful reading might suggest that Mesopotamian creation stories are especially vulnerable to this effect, because they are so tied to function. If humans exist to work, serve, maintain, and uphold order, then any earlier imagination of humans as something less fixed, less successful, or less clearly assigned may have been awkward for later tradition. A more cautious explanation could be that no such prior stage ever existed as a coherent story at all. Perhaps there were only loose motifs, narrative hesitations, and passing images later organised into a more stable doctrine of human purpose. That is not a dramatic erasure, but it is still a kind of loss. The fuzzier edges disappear. The polished version remains. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. You feel that mystery most strongly in the notion of the smudge. Not a dramatic deletion, not thunder, not fire, not some jealous deity snapping shut the cosmic archive. Just a smudge. A line pressed into wet clay and then partially flattened. A phrase copied once and then not again. A version remembered in a school tradition for a generation or two, before giving way to something more stable. Most historians agree that such quiet disappearance is far more plausible than a single event of forced erasure. Yet one interpretation is that from the perspective of later readers, quiet disappearance feels eerily similar. If a story is no longer available, its absence still shapes the imagination. And then there is clay itself, that patient accomplice to memory and forgetting. Clay keeps what fire hardens, but it also fractures, softens flakes, and returns to dust. One interpretation is that the metaphor and the medium reinforce each other. If human beings in Mesopotamian myth are made from malleable material, and the myths about them are also written on malleable material, then both humanity and memory are vulnerable to revision. That may be symbolic rather than intentional, but symbols sometimes tell on a culture better than formal declarations do. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. We do not have a mainstream accepted Sumerian tablet saying there was once a discarded prototype of humanity who got edited out of the final release. Let me rephrase that more carefully. What we do have are layered traditions, functional origin myths, and the very normal ancient habit of preserving some versions more faithfully than others. That raises the possibility that what later readers sense as an erased version may reflect narrative pruning rather than a hidden biological event. And narrative pruning can be powerful. It shapes not only what survives, but what later generations think was ever possible. If the surviving myths present humanity as a clear solution to divine labour, then that clarity may itself be the product of time. Earlier ambiguity may have existed and then thinned. Earlier discomfort may have been reframed as purpose. Earlier uncertainty may have dried into doctrine, the way soft clay dries into something that looks inevitable once it hardens. The city around you is almost asleep now. A faint breeze moves through the reeds. Somewhere a lamp gutters. A clay tablet rests on a shelf, its surface marked by a story that lasted. And beneath that lasting story, you can almost sense the pressure of another possibility, not fully visible, not fully gone. Not a secret revelation exactly, but the impression of an older hand beneath the final inscription. As though the human tale we inherited may be only the most durable version of a question, the ancient world never completely settled. And from that faint smudge beneath the final inscription, your thoughts drift toward a more physical kind of disappearance, because stories are not the only fragile things in Mesopotamia. Tablets break, roofs collapse, archives flood, mud brick walls soften back into the earth they were borrowed from. Most historians agree that an enormous amount of Mesopotamian literature has been lost through ordinary history alone, through accident, neglect, war reuse and time. What's broadly accepted is that the survival of any tablet at all often depends on luck so absurd that it almost feels like a joke played by the ancient world. A city burns, and the fire that destroys a library may also bake certain tablets hard enough to preserve them. Another archive remains peaceful, respectable, and perfectly sensible, and its clay quietly dissolves over centuries into nothing. Preservation, like destiny, is not always fair. Archaeology suggests that many cuneiform texts survive only in fragments, and often in copies, made long after the original composition. The evidence we do have points to repeated layers of vulnerability. First, the text must be written, then stored, then not broken, or at least not broken beyond recovery, then found, then read, then understood correctly by someone much later who is squinting at damaged signs and trying not to invent things out of enthusiasm. It is a miracle with paperwork, and because of that, any discussion of erasure has to begin on very sober ground. A more cautious explanation could be that what disappeared from Mesopotamian myth disappeared for the same reason most things disappear in history, because materials fail, buildings fall, and nobody had a climate-controlled archive with labelled plastic bins. That said, human beings have always been perfectly capable of helping forgetfulness along. Historians still argue whether certain mythic gaps are best explained by random loss or by selective copying shaped by institutional priorities. That debate matters because there is a meaningful difference between a story vanishing through ordinary decay and a story fading because later scribes preferred other versions. One interpretation is that many troubling, inconvenient, or simply outdated themes may have been allowed to die through neglect rather than openly suppressed. That is a softer form of erasure, but not necessarily a weaker one. If a text stops being copied, it enters the long sleep of irrelevance, which is historically less dramatic than censorship, but often just as final. You picture an archive after disaster, shelves tilted, dust in the air, cracked tablets scattered across the floor, some still readable, others split through the middle so cleanly that a single missing corner can take a god's name, a key verb, and your remaining confidence all at once. The city outside may have fallen to invasion flood internal collapse, or just the slow indifference of centuries. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian urban history includes all of these forces at different times. The libraries and temple collections we rely on now were never eternal vaults. They were rooms in vulnerable cities built from vulnerable materials in a vulnerable landscape. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if later readers sense deliberate suppression because selective survival can feel intentional even when it is not? If one kind of myth survives more fully than another, the mind naturally starts assigning motive. Someone chose this. Someone hid that. Sometimes that may even be true in small ways. But often the truth is duller and therefore harder to love. The clay cracked. The shelf collapsed. The copy was never made. A dynasty ended and took its preferred texts with it. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. Still, a fringe idea proposes that troubling versions of human origins were intentionally removed because they challenged temple orthodoxy or divine legitimacy. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it persists because ancient religious institutions, like most institutions, were not neutral about the stories that upheld their authority. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, there is at least a modest version of the idea that deserves consideration, not a grand purge of forbidden truth, but the ordinary tendency of powerful systems to preserve the narratives that make them look necessary, orderly and wise. That smaller claim fits the evidence better. Archaeology suggests that scribal culture in Mesopotamia was institutional, educational, and often tied to elite settings. The evidence we do have points to preservation shaped by schools, temples, courts, and literate traditions with their own priorities. A careful reading might suggest that myths emphasizing stable divine order and clear human purpose were more likely to remain useful than myths full of unresolved ambiguity. A more cautious explanation could be that stable myths simply made better teaching texts. Either way, the result can look similar from a distance. The cleaner version lasts. The messier one becomes rumour, residue or silence. And silence has a way of encouraging imagination. If a line is broken, you wonder what filled it. If a tablet ends abruptly, you feel the itch of missing closure. If one text hints at divine dissatisfaction and another presents neat resolution, you begin to suspect a middle layer that may never be recoverable. That suspicion is natural. It is also dangerous if you let it grow wild. We'll keep the solid ground separate from the mist. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. So the firm ground is this. Most historians agree that loss through damage and uneven preservation explains a great deal of what is missing from Mesopotamian literature. Historians still argue whether selective copying also shaped the surviving picture in deeper ways. One interpretation is that the idea of an erased version of humanity might reflect this very process, not one vanished species in the biological sense, but one narrative possibility lost, because it was not the version institutions kept alive. That is suggestive, not conclusive. The image that lingers is not fire, but shelving, not thunder, but preference, a tablet set aside, another one recopied, one myth taught to apprentices for generations, another allowed to moulder in a side room until damp reached it first. Human memory is often maintained by boring choices repeated over time, which may be the least glamorous sentence ever spoken about ancient mystery, but possibly one of the truest. And yet, there is something eerie in the thought all the same. You imagine a text once read aloud by lamplight, its lines perhaps less orderly, perhaps stranger, perhaps more uncertain about what humans were before they became the official answer to divine labour. Maybe it was lost in a collapse. Maybe it simply stopped mattering to the people with the styluses. Maybe parts of it survived only as echoes folded into later myths. Most historians agree that we cannot know for sure, But if we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, the missing piece becomes part of the meaning. Not because absence proves a secret, but because absence shapes what later generations are able to imagine. So you stand in the afterlife of broken archives, listening to the silence between the surviving lines. Flood and fire took their share. Time took more. Institutions may have favoured some stories over others. And somewhere inside that ordinary ancient wreckage lies the quiet force of the idea itself, that what was lost may matter not because it contained a single hidden answer, but because it reminds you how easily human origins, like human memories, can be rewritten by whatever happens to survive. And once you accept that survival is never neutral, the people who managed memory begin to loom larger in the dark. Not as cartoon villains with secret vault keys and theatrical eyebrows, but as priests, scribes, officials and rulers doing what institutions have always done, preserving what supports order, neglecting what no longer fits, and wrapping necessity in sacred language until it sounds eternal. Most historians agree that in Mesopotamia, temples and palaces were central to administration ritual life and the organisation of knowledge. What's broadly accepted is that they did not simply house belief, they structured it. They gave myths a place to be copied, performed, and linked to authority. Archaeology suggests that temple institutions managed land labour offerings and archives in ways that made them both economic and religious centres. The evidence we do have points to an intimate connection between power and preservation. If a text mattered to ritual, kingship, education, or legitimacy, it had better odds of being copied. If it sat awkwardly outside those needs, its future was less secure. One interpretation is that myths which explained humanity as a stable servant class in a divinely ordered world would have been especially compatible with an institutional life. A more cautious explanation could be that these stories were simply widely meaningful, and therefore widely repeated. Either way, repetition has consequences. The story told most often becomes the story that feels original. You can almost watch the process happen. A scribe in training copies lines beneath a teacher's eye. A temple recitation favours one version of divine assembly over another. A ruler sponsors texts that harmonise cosmic order with earthly rule. No one has to whisper, "Let us erase the troublesome version." They only have to keep choosing the smoother one. Human memory responds well to routine. Once something is copied, taught, and recited enough times, alternatives begin to feel like mistakes rather than neighbours. Historians still argue whether Mesopotamian myths were curated consciously to support political and priestly power, or whether the alignment between story and institution was more organic than strategic. That distinction matters, but perhaps not as much as you might think. Institutions do not need to meet in a back room under dramatic torchlight to shape memory. They shape it by existing. A careful reading might suggest that the very structure of temple and palace culture naturally favoured narratives of order, hierarchy, and assigned purpose. If humans are made to serve divine needs, and temples are the visible machinery of that service, then the myth and the institution reinforce each other beautifully like two bricks drying side by side, which is very elegant, unless you are the person carrying the bricks. This is where the idea of official memory begins to feel less like conspiracy and more like gravity. Most historians agree that ancient Near Eastern states used ritual inscription and literary tradition to support kingship and divine order. That is mainstream ground. A fringe idea proposes that an earlier account of humanity, perhaps one emphasizing divine uncertainty, failed creations, or a more unstable relationship between gods and humans, was deliberately sidelined because it undermined institutional authority. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it remains tempting because systems of power do tend to prefer stories in which the system looks wise, necessary, and approved by heaven. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, the modest version is enough. Maybe what later institutions favoured was not a lie but a cleaner emphasis. The gods are orderly. Humanity has a role. Labour is sacred. Offerings matter. Kingship aligns with heaven. That worldview is not invented from nothing. It grows naturally from the social world of Mesopotamia. But one interpretation is that in becoming official, it may also have flattened earlier tensions. Divine conflict becomes background. Experimental uncertainty fades. The rough draft, if there ever was one, disappears into the final recital. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. You move through a temple complex in your mind now. Courtyards breathe with late heat. Storerooms sit heavy with grain and oil. A priest passes beneath a doorway painted with fading colour. Somewhere deeper inside, tablets rest in baskets, or on shelves, each one a small argument against oblivion. Yet even here, amid all this reverence for record forgetting is built in. Not every text is sacred in the same way. Not every hymn is copied every generation. Not every myth remains useful once theology shifts or political centres move. A more cautious explanation could be that official memory in Mesopotamia was often less about active suppression than about continuous practical selection. That practical selection may be the quietest form of power. It does not destroy alternatives dramatically. It simply starves them. One text becomes standard, another becomes optional, a third falls out of the curriculum entirely. Over time, what survives looks inevitable. That's a possibility, not a certainty, but it fits what we know about how literate traditions often function. The evidence we do have points to preservation through institutions, and preservation through institutions almost always comes with preferences attached. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if the true erasure here is psychological rather than archival? Once a society settles on a strong story of who humans are, for it becomes harder to imagine that the answer was ever unstable. The official version does not just replace alternatives on shelves, it replaces them in the mind. Humanity becomes the servant species, the cosmic workforce, the offering bearer, the canal clearer with a trace of divine substance and very few vacation days. Earlier ambiguity, if it existed, becomes nearly unthinkable. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. We cannot prove that priests and scribes intentionally buried a specific lost tablet describing an abandoned model of humankind. Let me rephrase that more carefully. What we can say is that Mesopotamian institutions helped stabilize certain stories, and stabilized stories tend to make older uncertainties harder to detect. That raises the possibility that the version that didn't last was not necessarily burned away. It may simply have become incompatible with the memory structures that endured. And there is something almost tender in that thought. Not because institutions are kind, they usually have the emotional charm of a tax ledger, but because the process is so human. People preserve the stories that help them live inside their world. Priests preserve what supports ritual. Kings preserve what dignifies rule. Scribes preserve what they are taught to preserve. None of this requires wicked intent. It requires continuity habit and a shared sense of what counts as meaningful. Historians still argue whether that process should be called theology ideology or simply tradition doing what tradition does. Maybe the best answer is yes. By now the night has thinned into that quiet hour when even ancient cities seem to exhale. A reed mat stirs near an open doorway. Oil light glows low against mud brick. The temple stands firm above the sleeping houses, not just a building, but a machine for turning labour into order and order into memory. And inside that machine, the story of humanity becomes more official with every generation that repeats it. Humans were made to serve. The gods required it. The world depends on it. The line hardens like baked clay. Yet the harder it becomes, the more you wonder what softness came before. What less polished version once breathed in the wet clay of older thoughts before the institutions of city, temple, and palace helped dry it into something permanent? Perhaps nothing dramatic was forced to disappear. Perhaps forgetting worked the way it usually does through favour repetition and quiet neglect. But from where you stand, listening to the hush around the shelves, even that kind of forgetting can feel like a deliberate hand withdrawing from the tablet just before the older marks are lost. And in that hush beside the shelves, with older marks fading under newer ones, you finally come to the texts that keep pulling people back into this mystery. Not because they state the modern theory outright, which they do not, but because they speak in ways that are structured enough to feel meaningful and fragmented, enough to feel unfinished. Most historians agree that key Mesopotamian works such as Atrahasis, Enuma Elish, and various Sumerian hymns and mythic traditions preserve ideas about divine assembly labour, cosmic order, and the place of humanity within that order. What's broadly accepted is that these texts do not all say the same thing in the same way. They belong to different moments, languages, and literary aims. But together they give you a framework sturdy enough to walk on, even if some of the planks still creak. Atrahasis is often one of the first places modern readers look, and for good reason. The evidence we do have points to a composition in which divine labour, divine complaint, and the making of humans are linked with unusual clarity. Most historians agree that in this tradition, humanity is created so that the gods, or at least certain gods, no longer have to bear exhausting toil themselves. That is mainstream ground. It is one of the clearest statements in ancient Mesopotamian literature that human existence is tied directly to labour transfer. A careful reading might suggest that this is not just a myth of origins, but a myth of institutional relief, a cosmic outsourcing arrangement with incense and consequence. That sounds funny until you realise how cold it can feel. In Atrahasis, the logic is sharp. There is burden, there is unrest, there is a need for resolution. Humanity appears as the answer. One interpretation is that this preserves in unusually direct form the old social truth that somebody must do the work sustaining civilization. Another is that the text reflects theological reflection on order, rebellion, and divine hierarchy. Historians still argue whether the emphasis should fall more on labour, ideology, ritual explanation, or literary drama, and the most honest answer is probably that the text does all three at once. Ancient myths rarely limit themselves to a single moral, like a children's cartoon with good lighting. Then there is Enuma Elish, the great Babylonian creation epic, which is often later and more politically charged in tone. Most historians agree that it is not a Sumerian text in the narrow sense, but it still matters deeply for the Mesopotamian tradition because it shows how creation, kingship, and divine order could be woven together in a highly formal mythic structure. What's broadly accepted is that after conflict among the gods, humanity is created to take on labour connected with divine service. A more cautious explanation could be that Enuma Elish reflects the priorities of a later imperial theology, especially in its elevation of Marduk and its orderly reshaping of cosmic power. One interpretation is that by the time you reach this text, the rougher tensions of older traditions have already been harmonised into a more official vision of the universe. That matters, because if you are looking for traces of an erased humanity, you are unlikely to find them in the form of a confession. You are more likely to feel them in the difference between textures. Atrahasis can feel like negotiation under strain. Enuma Elish can feel like resolution after struggle. Sumerian materials, depending on the text, can feel more local, more fluid, more distributed across divine relationships and civic needs. The evidence we do have points to a tradition that evolves not by abandoning core questions, but by recasting them. A fringe idea proposes that these differences preserve the faint outline of a lost earlier narrative about flawed or provisional humans. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it persists because the comparison between texts really does reveal movement, and movement invites questions about what got left behind. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, the safer claim is still intriguing. Perhaps the texts do not preserve a lost race of humans so much as a lost imaginative stage, a phase in which the meaning of human creation was less settled. A careful reading might suggest that later compositions emphasize finality more strongly because their religious and political environments demanded it. A more cautious explanation could be that literary Polish alone accounts for the effect. Either way, the what of creation remains linked to service, while the why becomes increasingly formalized. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if the very consistency of labour across these texts is the clue? Not because it proves a hidden event, but because it reveals what mattered enough to survive every retelling. Human beings carry burden. Gods receive relief. Order is maintained through service. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. Did all traditions always imagine this arrangement the same way? Or were some earlier versions more uncertain, more experimental, or more uneasy about what it meant? The surviving tablets do not hand you a final answer. They hand you recurring pressure. That recurring pressure becomes even more fascinating when you notice how rarely the texts indulge human vanity. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian creation literature does not generally flatter humanity as the centre of creation in the modern sentimental sense. Humans matter, but often because they are needed. One interpretation is that this realism gives the texts their peculiar force. Another is that it reflects the societies that produced them, urban, hierarchical, labour-intensive, and deeply attentive to institutional order. Archaeology suggests that such conditions shape not only daily life, but the stories people found persuasive. A myth in which humans are sacred assistants may sound harsh now, but to ancient listeners it may have sounded as practical as weather. And yet, the texts also leave room for dignity. If humans are made with divine substance, if they participate in ritual, if they support the sacred order of the world, then usefulness is not the whole story. Historians still argue whether the divine element in these texts elevates human status meaningfully or merely legitimizes human obligation. There is no full consensus, and that ambiguity is important. It prevents the myths from becoming too simple. You are mud, yes, but not only mud. You are useful, yes, but perhaps not only useful. The human being in Mesopotamian literature seems always to stand between low material and high assignment, between dust and duty. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. We do not have a line in Atrahasis or Enuma Elish that states plainly and beyond debate that the Anunnaki created one version of humans and then forced its memory to be erased. Let me rephrase that more carefully. What we do have are texts that clearly link divine labour problems with human creation, texts that show theological development over time, and texts that leave enough gaps for modern readers to wonder whether the final surviving account is more polished than the earliest one ever was. We're not proving anything tonight. We're following clues, and the clues lead you to a quiet but powerful conclusion. The tablets actually say less than the modern rumour wants, and more than a casual reading notices. They do not reveal a neat forbidden history. They reveal a persistent Mesopotamian concern with burden order, divine hierarchy, and the making of humans for a role that feels both necessary and unsettling. If there was ever an erased version, it may not survive as a clear tale. It may survive only as pressure between the texts, as the sense that the final shape of the story rests over older, rougher ground still faintly visible through the cracks. And once you begin to feel that pressure between the texts, the question slips quietly from the gods back down to the people who had to live under these stories. Because whatever the Anunnaki meant in theology, and whatever creation meant in myth, ordinary Mesopotamians still had to wake up wash, with limited success, count the day's tasks and carry their bodies through a world that demanded constant effort. Most historians agree that daily life in ancient Mesopotamia was shaped by hard labour, seasonal uncertainty, dependence on irrigation, and social hierarchy. What's broadly accepted is that existence there was not abstractly sacred so much as concretely demanding. Fields needed tending, canals needed clearing, brickwork needed repair, animals needed feeding, officials needed records, temples needed offerings. Life was full of very practical verbs. Archaeology suggests that urban Mesopotamian society depended on interlocking systems of work, from agriculture and herding to textile production, transport, construction, and administration. The evidence we do have points to a world where no one would have found the idea of humanity being made for service, especially implausible. It would have felt, if anything, a little too on the nose. One interpretation is that creation stories about humans carrying divine burdens mirrored how people experienced themselves within the state and temple economy. A more cautious explanation could be that the myths provided meaning for labour rather than merely reflecting it. Either way, the fit is close enough to make you pause. You imagine an ordinary day beginning before the heat fully rises. A worker steps onto packed earth, still cool from night. Somewhere nearby, someone is already grinding grain. Someone else is hauling jars. A child is sent with a message or a basket. A scribe smooths damp clay and braces for a long morning of numbers. The smell of mud brick wall smoke and river damp hangs in the air. This is not the glamorous end of civilization. It is the end that keeps civilization from collapsing. Most historians agree that the grandeur of Mesopotamia rested on the repetitive labour of people whose names rarely enter the literature except as counts categories or obligations. That is why the phrase made for service lands differently once you think about actual bodies. It stops being merely cosmic and starts sounding social. One interpretation is that the myths functioned as a mirror in which ordinary people could see their labour dignified by divine necessity. Another is that the same stories helped naturalise hierarchy by telling listeners that service was built into the structure of existence. Historians still argue whether such myths should be understood primarily as ideological tools or as shared frameworks of meaning. Perhaps they were both. Human beings are very good at finding dignity inside systems that also constrain them. They usually have to be. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if the erased version of humanity is not a missing biological type or a vanished secret text, but an erased emotional possibility? A version of being human not defined so completely by usefulness. That is not a historical conclusion. It is gentle imagination moving in the lamplight of the evidence. But it helps explain why these stories still feel so sharp. They speak to a fear older than written language that your worth may be measured mainly by what you maintain for powers above you. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. We cannot recover the private thoughts of a canal worker, a brewer, a weaver, or a temple porter, listening to a story about the gods creating humans to bear labour. Some may have found it reassuring, some may have found it obvious. Some may have half listened while thinking about lunch, which is one of history's most consistent human behaviours. Still, the evidence we do have points to a society in which labour was public, collective, and unavoidable. A careful reading might suggest that myths of human purpose gained traction because they matched lived reality with almost uncomfortable precision. A fringe idea proposes that tales of humanity as a workforce preserve memory of a more literal servant class engineered by higher beings and later forgotten behind metaphor. This theory isn't widely accepted, and most historians would place it firmly in the category of modern speculation. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, though it serves a useful purpose, by forcing you to notice how intensely functional human identity appears in the surviving stories. Even without the fringe leap, the mainstream picture is already strange enough. You are made from earth, perhaps mixed with divine essence, and then inserted into a labour system so old it is projected into mythic time itself. That is suggestive, not conclusive, but it is haunting. You move through the city again, slower now. Women card wool in a courtyard. Men unload baskets from a boat. Someone patches a wall where the last rain did damage. Someone else mutters at a donkey, with the defeated tone of a person who has already lost the argument. The whole place hums with necessity. Archaeology suggests that Mesopotamian economies required extensive organisation of manpower, materials, and seasonal rhythms. Most historians agree that this practical reality shaped the worldview reflected in literature. The gods in such a world do not float free of production. They receive offerings produced by work. Temples function because people function. Order is sacred. But sacred order is surprisingly dependent on whether someone remembered to bring in the barley. One interpretation is that this created a peculiar kind of human self-understanding. People were lowly in substance made of clay, vulnerable to disease, flood drought, and royal demands. But they were also indispensable within the sacred system. You could call that a kind of dignity, though a very conditional one. A more cautious explanation could be that the texts preserve less comfort than compliance. Still, even compliance can become meaningful over generations. If your society tells the same story long enough, eventually the burden begins to sound like purpose. Historians still argue whether Mesopotamian religion offered ordinary people emotional consolation in the way later traditions often did, or whether its main strength lay in ritual, order, and communal stability rather than personal reassurance. There's no full consensus, and that uncertainty matters. It reminds you not to import modern expectations too quickly. Ancient listeners may not have needed a myth to tell them they were individually cherished. They may have needed it to tell them the world, however hard, was not random. Service could be exhausting and still feel cosmically placed. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. We cannot know whether everyday Mesopotamians thought in terms anything like an erased version of humanity. Let me rephrase that more carefully. What we can say is that the surviving myths reflect a society where human usefulness was central, and where stories of origin likely reinforced, explained, or ritualized that fact. If there was another way of imagining humanity once available in the tradition, it left very little that can be securely recovered. And maybe that is exactly what lingers. Not a lost species, not a forbidden tablet hidden under temple stairs, just the sense that the surviving answer is a little too efficient. Humans exist to bear, burden, serve the gods, maintain order. It fits the city, it fits the institutions, it fits the labouring body. It fits so well that you begin to wonder whether older, softer, stranger possibilities were once present and then quietly worn away. The night settles more deeply around the mud brick walls. The river beyond the city glides on in the dark, carrying silt memory and the occasional deeply disappointed reed boat. And you stand there listening to the ordinary sounds of an ordinary ancient world, realizing that perhaps the oldest fear hidden inside these myths is not that the gods made humanity once and erased it, but that they made humanity useful, and that usefulness became the version of us most likely to survive in story. And once you notice how efficiently the surviving stories define humanity through usefulness, you can understand why modern readers sometimes lean toward the fringe edge of the room, where the lamplight reaches only part way and speculation begins to look strangely inviting. Most historians agree that readings of the Anunnaki as literal extraterrestrial engineers belong to modern alternative theory, not to mainstream ancient Near Eastern scholarship. What's broadly accepted is that these interpretations rely heavily on selective translation modern projection, and a habit of treating symbolic myth as technical description. Still, they do not become popular by accident. They become popular because the old texts really are unusual, really are fragmentary, and really do describe humanity in ways that can feel more constructed than cherished. A fringe idea proposes that the Anunnaki were actual makers, revising humanity as a project producing one or more earlier versions before arriving at the servant model that survived in later tradition. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it draws energy from several real features of the Mesopotamian material. Divine assembly's creation through mixed substances, the burden of labour, and the gaps between surviving texts. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, the theory becomes a kind of dramatic paraphrase of something the mainstream reading already sees more quietly. Humanity in these myths is shaped for a task within a hierarchy that precedes it. That quieter point matters more than the cosmic dramatics. A careful reading might suggest that the popularity of the fringe theory comes not from its evidence, which is thin, but from its emotional precision. It takes an ancient fear and modernizes it. The fear is that humans are designed by powers above them for purposes not entirely their own. Put that in a mud brick temple and it becomes theology. Put it in a spaceship and it becomes paperback destiny. Same discomfort, better cover art. Historians still argue whether the modern fascination with the Anunnaki tells us more about ancient Mesopotamia or about contemporary anxiety. The safest answer is that it tells us a great deal about the present. In a world shaped by systems bureaucracy, labour exhaustion, and the uneasy feeling that most people are living inside designs made elsewhere, the idea of engineered humanity lands with disturbing ease. One interpretation is that fringe Anunnaki theories survive because they translate old myths into a language of technology control and revision that modern audiences instinctively understand. A more cautious explanation could be that people simply enjoy mysteries with dramatic nouns in them. Both are probably true. Human beings contain multitudes and questionable documentaries. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if the alien reading, for all its historical problems, accidentally preserves the emotional truth of the older myths better than some sanitized summaries do? Not because the Anunnaki were astronauts. That's a possibility some people enjoy, but it's not a conclusion supported by mainstream evidence. Rather because the fringe reading notices how unsettling the core premise already is. Humanity is made. Humanity is assigned. Humanity may be revised in story, if not in flesh. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. And what we can confirm is already enough to keep you awake, if this were not very specifically a bedtime channel. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian creation literature presents humans as occupying a dependent position inside divine order. Archaeology suggests that this mirrors real social and institutional hierarchies in ancient urban life. The evidence we do have points to stories that are less interested in individual self-expression than in collective function. That is the solid ground. The speculative layer the one modern readers pile on top says, perhaps the old myths preserve memory of literal intervention, perhaps of experimental stages, perhaps of forced forgetting. This theory isn't widely accepted, but its appeal lies in how neatly it dramatises the unease already present in the mainstream story. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, we can borrow its question without borrowing its certainty. Why did the text feel as though humans were configured rather than simply born into meaning? Why do some passages sound like solutions to a problem rather than celebrations of life? Why does the divine world in Mesopotamian literature so often resemble a hierarchy managing labour, conflict and order? Those are excellent questions. They do not require flying machines over Sumer. They require patience language and a willingness to sit with ambiguity without immediately dressing it in silver metal. You can imagine the modern fringe reader standing beside the ancient scribe, each suspicious for different reasons. The modern reader suspects buried technology. The scribe suspects missed offerings, unstable kings, divine displeasure, and apprentices with terrible handwriting. Yet both in their own way feel that the world above humanity may be organised distant and not especially sentimental. One interpretation is that this shared mood is why the Anunnaki remain culturally sticky. They offer a vocabulary for power that feels ancient and contemporary at once. A more cautious explanation could be that the Anunnaki have simply become a cultural magnet because their name is evocative, their roles are flexible, and the texts are obscure enough to invite confident nonsense. That is also true. Obscurity is the natural habitat of overstatement, but you do not need to mock the fringe entirely to separate ground from mist. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. The literal engineering reading is thin. The emotional unease behind it is not. That distinction lets you keep what is interesting without pretending more than the sources allow. Most historians agree that the mainstream scholarly approach reads the Anunnaki as deities within Mesopotamian religion, not alien biodesigners. Historians still argue whether certain motifs in the texts preserve older theological tensions, now partly obscured by later literary shaping. One interpretation is that the modern fringe obsession with revised humanity dramatizes in exaggerated form the ancient sense that humans were brought into existence to resolve a burden within a larger system. That is suggestive, not conclusive. And perhaps that is why the fringe idea glows so stubbornly in modern lamplight. It offers a clean answer where the tablets offer layered discomfort. It turns symbolic clay into engineered matter. It turns divine hierarchy into project management. It turns textual silence into intentional concealment. None of that is widely accepted history, yet if we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it can still serve as a mirror. Not a mirror showing what the Anunnaki really were, but one showing how readers respond when ancient stories refuse to flatter them. Because the surviving Mesopotamian myths do not flatter you much. They do not say you are central because you are loved. They suggest you matter because you are needed. That is a very different atmosphere. And once modern readers feel that atmosphere, some of them instinctively translate it into the language of a who experiment revision and hidden design. They may be wrong about the mechanism, but they are not wrong to feel the chill. The city in your mind is quiet now. The temple outlines soft against the dark. The shelves of clay holding their patient half-answers. Somewhere between scholarship and rumour, between philology and late-night speculation, the question lingers on. Not whether the Anunnaki literally engineered an erased human model, because the evidence for that is not strong. But why the ancient texts make so many people feel as though humanity entered the story under instruction, under pressure, and perhaps under revision. And in that lingering feeling, the fringe idea finds just enough warmth to keep breathing, even while the stronger light of careful history continues to trim it back. And when the warmer glow of rumour begins to fade, you are left with the slower, steadier work of separating what holds from what only shimmers. This may be the most ancient ritual of all, even more ancient than the stories themselves, placing one hand on the tablet and the other in the mist, then trying not to confuse which is which. Most historians agree that our safest footing in Mesopotamian studies comes from a combination of philology, archaeology, and context. What's broadly accepted is that no single text can be read in isolation. No damaged line should be inflated into certainty, and no modern theory becomes stronger just because it sounds cinematic in a dark room. The evidence we do have points to a human task older than commentary sections, and just as difficult, namely learning how to live with partial knowledge without immediately filling every gap with thunder. So you slow down. You look again at the clay tablets, the labour myths, the temple institutions, the divine hierarchies, the repeated link between humanity and burden. On solid ground, the picture is already striking. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian creation traditions often connect humans to service order and the practical needs of a divine world imagined in terms that mirror ancient society. Archaeology suggests that this made deep sense in a civilization built on irrigation administration and coordinated labour. The evidence we do have points to a worldview in which people were understood through function as much as through identity. That much stands firmly enough. Then comes interpretation. One interpretation is that the repeated emphasis on labour, mixed substances, and cosmic hierarchy may preserve not literal hidden events, but deep cultural anxieties about dependence, replaceability, and purpose. A careful reading might suggest that humanity in these myths is not merely created but positioned slotted into a world already arranged by greater powers. That is not fringe. That is a reasonable reading of the emotional architecture of the texts. A more cautious explanation could be that all ancient societies place humans in relation to larger orders, and Mesopotamia simply expressed that relation with unusual bluntness. Still, bluntness has a way of lingering. Historians still argue whether the tension in these stories comes mainly from theology, from social structure, from literary inheritance, or from all three at once. There's no full consensus, and that lack of consensus is useful. It keeps you from pretending the evidence is tidier than it is. It also reminds you that myths can preserve emotional truths without preserving events in any modern historical sense. A society may not remember exactly what happened in the beginning, but it may remember what it feared the beginning meant. That may be the most important distinction of the night. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if the erased version of humanity is at heart an erased fear rather than an erased species? A fear that humans are replaceable, a fear that purpose can be assigned from above, a fear that what makes you valuable may also make you expendable. That is gentle imagination, not a documented conclusion, but it rests surprisingly close to the mood of the surviving material. If gods create humans because labour must be done, then the hidden terror beneath the story is easy to feel. If labour defines you, what happens when a different kind of worker is needed? The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. And what we cannot confirm is exactly where modern overreach begins to pace back and forth in the hallway. A fringe idea proposes that the Anunnaki literally revised humanity more than once, and that traces of those revisions survive in broken myths, altered copies, and narrative seams. This theory isn't widely accepted, and the evidence is thin. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. The literal fringe claim belongs mostly to the realm of modern speculative storytelling, but if we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it still performs one useful function. It forces attention onto the instability that the cleaner summaries often hide. That instability is real, not in the sense of secret laboratories or lost technical manuals, but in the sense that the texts do not always present humanity with one perfectly smooth voice. There are shifts in emphasis. There are layered traditions. There are later forms of older material. There are institutions shaping memory. One interpretation is that the polished version of human purpose that survived may indeed rest on rougher ground. A more cautious explanation could be that this roughness is simply how ancient literature looks when too much has been lost. Both readings deserve a hearing. Neither should be mistaken for complete possession of the truth. You can feel now how useful the ground and mist rule really is. On the ground there are temples, canals, ration systems, divine assemblies and texts that link human creation to labour. In the mist there are possibilities, lost layers, softened tensions, pruned narratives, symbolic revisions mistaken later for literal ones. The danger comes when readers try to build a palace entirely in the mist and then insist it has plumbing. Sleepy as tonight may be, we should avoid that. Still, the mist has its value. Imagination used gently helps you notice shapes before it claims to understand them. A careful reading might suggest that Mesopotamian myths remain powerful precisely because they refuse to satisfy modern emotional expectations. They do not insist that humans are the treasured centerpiece of all creation. They place humans inside a structure of need. That can sound harsh, but it can also sound honest in a way later traditions sometimes soften. We are needed, yes. We are lowly, yes. We are linked somehow to the divine, yes. But none of this guarantees comfort. The old stories are not trying to soothe your ego. They are trying to explain your burden. Most historians agree that this is one reason Mesopotamian literature still feels so modern in odd flashes. Not because it predicts technology, but because it understands systems. It understands administration hierarchy, labour pressure, and the way institutions turn necessity into worldview. Archaeology suggests that these were not abstract concerns. They were built into the daily operation of city life. One interpretation is that when later readers sense an erased humanity behind the myths, they may actually be sensing how strongly the surviving texts reduce human possibility to function. The erased thing may be a wider sense of what a human being could mean. That's a possibility, not a certainty. You sit with that for a while. The reed stylus scratches softly. The clay waits. The lamp flame bends and straightens again. Somewhere beyond the walls, the river keeps carrying silt toward futures that have not happened yet. And inside this dim room, surrounded by stories both durable and broken, you realise that careful reading is not the enemy of wonder. It is what lets wonder breathe without turning dishonest. We are not proving anything tonight, we're following clues. The clues tell you that the Anunnaki belong to an ancient divine order, that humans in Mesopotamian myth are closely tied to labour and service, and that later retellings shaped how these ideas reached us. They also tell you that myth can carry buried feelings no single line is able to state plainly, so perhaps the cleanest conclusion is also the quietest. The texts may not preserve a hidden biological version of humanity forced into erasure, but they may preserve something just as human, and in its way, just as haunting. The feeling that being human was never entirely secure, that our role in the cosmos could be assigned, revised and narrated by powers above us, and that whatever older possibilities once existed in the imagination were gradually narrowed into the version of us that best fit the world that survived. And once that quiet conclusion settles over you, the last tablet of the night feels less like a document and more like a mirror left on a shelf too long, still reflecting, still dim, still honest in the places where it has cracked. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian myths tell you at least as much about human worry as they do about divine power. What's broadly accepted is that these stories emerged from a civilization shaped by labour, hierarchy, ritual, fragile cities and rivers that could bless or betray with equal ease. So when you hear of gods' divine assemblies, mixed clay, assigned burdens, and humans brought into being to stabilise a strained order, you are hearing not only a theory of origins, but a theory of what it feels like to be alive in a difficult world. That may be the oldest part of the story, and also the part that lingers longest, because by now you have walked through the mud brick streets, stood near the canals, watched scribes press signs into wet clay, listened for older meanings beneath later copies, and followed the Anunnaki from divine title into modern rumour and back again. Most historians agree that the safest reading keeps them within the framework of ancient Mesopotamian religion as powerful deities within a layered and changing tradition. Archaeology suggests that the texts linking humanity to labour and sacred order arose from real social conditions, not from hidden technical manuals disguised as myth. The evidence we do have points to a world where humans were imagined as functional, dependent, and necessary, but also tied in some mysterious way to divine substance and divine systems. Historians still argue whether the shifts between different texts reflect changing theology, political emphasis, literary habit, or older narrative tensions that were never fully resolved. That debate is worth keeping open. It protects the story from becoming too neat. One interpretation is that the idea of a version of humans they forced to erase makes best sense not as a literal secret buried under a temple floor, but as a dramatic way of naming what old traditions often do. They narrow, they standardize, they favour one answer over another. A more cautious explanation could be that what feels erased to modern readers is simply what time failed to preserve. But even that gentler answer carries weight. A lost possibility is still a loss whether it vanishes through censorship or through centuries of dust. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if the final lesson of these myths is not that the gods once deleted a prototype humanity, but that human beings have always feared being defined too narrowly by the needs of the systems above them? That is not a documented conclusion. It is gentle imagination laid carefully beside the evidence. Yet it fits the atmosphere of the tablets remarkably well. In the surviving Mesopotamian stories, people are made from lowly material and given high obligation. They belong to the earth, but they are not free from demand. They are needed, but not necessarily cherished in the way later traditions might emphasize. They are part of the order, though the order does not exist for them alone. That is a haunting arrangement. It is also a very recognizable one. A fringe idea proposes that the Anunnaki were literal revisers of humanity, and that the surviving myths preserve traces of multiple engineered versions. This theory isn't widely accepted, and if the evidence is thin, we'll say so. It is thin. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, the fringe idea becomes less a claim to swallow whole and more a dramatic expression of a quieter truth. The quiet truth is that the Mesopotamian imagination could envision human beings as made for a task placed into a hierarchy and remembered through stories shaped by institutions that valued order. That alone is enough to explain why modern readers keep sensing revision in the background. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. We cannot confirm a hidden first humanity. We cannot confirm an official act of forced erasure in the dramatic modern sense. We cannot confirm that every inconsistency conceals a lost narrative layer. But we can say with care that the surviving traditions leave behind the impression of older roughness beneath later polish. We can say that humanity's role in these stories is unusually functional. We can say that myths often preserve the emotional truth of a culture even when they do not preserve events in a modern historical way. And we can say that the question itself, why humans seem made for burden in these texts, is far older and more interesting than many flashy modern answers. So you return one last time to the simplest image of all, a hand pressing clay, a shape forming, a role assigned, a line written down. Somewhere in that sequence lies the whole strange beauty of Mesopotamia, civilization built from mud and memory, gods imagined through institutions, people understanding themselves through work offering, and dependence on forces larger than any one life. The Anunnaki, whether distant rulers of the divine order, or flexible names within that order, belong to that world. Humanity belongs to it too, and the oldest whisper inside the story may be that to be made is also to be given a place, which can feel like meaning or like confinement depending on where you stand. Now the night can soften. The reed stylus grows still, the clay cools. The lamp burns lower at its light, no longer asking for answers, only casting a little warmth across the shelves. You do not need to solve the whole mystery before sleep. You only need to let the pieces rest where they are. Somewhere beyond the city, the rivers continue their slow, dark movement through the plain, carrying silt from old mountains into fields that will green again when the season turns. The mud brick walls release the day's stored heat. A courtyard falls quiet. A dog curls into itself. A temple doorway stands open to the night, and no one hurries through it now. The old questions can remain old questions. Maybe the story preserved a memory of revision. Maybe it preserved only the feeling of it. Maybe what was erased was not a body, but a possibility. A softer version of what humans hoped they were. A less burdened one. A less assigned one. Or maybe time doing what time always does simply left you with fragments sharp enough to wander over and gentle enough to set down. So let the tablets rest in their half-light. Let the gods remain a little distant. Let the clay keep its silence. And let the final image grow quieter now. A river plain under stars, a city of mud brick, sleeping a shelf of stories drying into permanence, and you drifting away before the last unanswered line can trouble you any further.